Hello. In the first presentation, you'll remember that we looked at how power in the United Kingdom gradually moved from being held by one person to being held, in part, by all of us through the way that we vote for members of Parliament who are supposed to represent our interests in Parliament. In this second presentation, we're going to look in a bit more detail at how politics works in the UK. So, we're going to look at how the country is run by looking in more depth at the Houses of Parliament. And we're going to talk a bit about how we, as people living in the UK, can get involved in politics. To start, it's important to know that Parliament is actually made up of three different parts: the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarch, which is currently Queen Elizabeth II. So let's look at each of those in a bit more detail. The House of Commons is where the people that we elect as members of Parliament work for most of the time. And the House of Commons has a really important role. It's where important issues are debated. It makes new laws and reviews existing ones. It also approves the plans that the government has to spend its money, and where the opposition party challenges the government and makes sure it's doing its job properly. Ultimately, the House of Commons' role is to represent the public. And the image that you can see on the screen is from the House of Commons. You might recognise it from the television. The government always sits on the left of the picture and the opposition on the right. The Cabinet, who run important departments for the government, and the Prime Minister sit on the front bench on the left, and the senior members of the opposition sit on the front bench on the right. And that's why you might hear senior MPs being called front benchers. Now, there are only 437 seats in the Houses of Commons, but there are 650 people, so that's why it can sometimes look very full when you see it on the telly. And finally, the Speaker sits in the middle and keeps order over the debates and discussions that take place in the House of Commons. Now, the House of Lords is different. This is the second part of Parliament. The House of Lords is made up of 800 lords who sit in this chamber. Now, they're not elected. Once they were chosen on the basis of who their family was, but now that's changing, and they're selected to sit in the House of Lords because of their knowledge or experience and what they've achieved during their lives. The House of Lords is laid out just like the House of Commons, so that the government is on the left and the opposition on the right. There are also cross-benchers who don't belong to any political party and sit in the middle. Unlike the House of Commons, there's no majority for the government or any other political party in the House of Lords. Now, their job is to question what the government is doing. It also helps to change and amend laws that are being proposed by the House of Commons, and helps to investigate different issues to help improve how the country is run. And finally, the third part of Parliament is the monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Now, she plays a role in rubber stamping and approving new laws, and she also meets the Prime Minister every week, but her role is really mainly ceremonial. She has no real political power. Now, as well as the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister and his cabinet, there's another branch of government called the judiciary. And this is the legal system which upholds the rule of law in the country. So, judicial power is the power to interpret the law and involves criminal courts and civil courts. The judiciary is independent and neutral. It's separate from the government and it has a number of roles. One of its main roles is to interpret the laws that are made by Parliament. And it does so as it gives out justice by sentencing people for crimes or for settling disputes between people. The judiciary is also responsible for something called judicial review, and that involves deciding whether a public body, which includes the government, has behaved legally. So, who is in charge then? Well, it's complicated. The monarch is the head of state, but she has relatively little real power. The government sets the agenda and runs the country. Parliament makes laws, represents us as the people who live in the country, and challenges the government to make sure it's doing as good a job as it can, whilst the judiciary upholds and enforces the law. And then us, the people, elect members of Parliament, and we can campaign for change. Now, it might seem difficult after hearing about the House of Lords and the government and the judiciary to know how we might get involved in politics. But it's really important to remember that all those changes that I talked about in the first presentation, that meant men and women were ultimately able to vote and that saw the United Kingdom become a liberal democracy, those changes didn't happen easily and they didn't happen quickly. They also didn't happen on their own. Change happened because people got involved. And there are still lots of different ways that we can try and make things better in the communities we live in. For those who are eligible, we can vote for members of Parliament who we feel best represent our interests and our values. Anybody can contact their local MP and ask for answers to questions, raise problems, and ask for their help. We can also join political parties, whether that's the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and so on, and in that way get directly involved in party politics. We might raise a petition if there's something that we really want to see changed. We can ask lots of people to sign their agreement with a particular idea or proposal, which we might then take to our Member of Parliament and ask them to help us make it happen. We can also campaign. Campaign groups take lots of different forms. We can do something called lobbying, which means making a case for a change to local politicians. We can even get involved in peaceful, non-violent protest and activism, where we try raise attention and show that a particular issue really matters and needs to change. But we can also volunteer in our local community. We can learn about what's going on around us and what might need to change, or what might need to stay the same. Ultimately, everything starts with a conversation, a discussion between people to decide the kind of life that they want to live and where and how they want to live it. So that's the important thing, that even though there are lots of big institutions and structures in the UK, we, as people living here, have rights to contact our MP, to get involved in politics, to join campaign groups, to volunteer, and to start conversations about changes that we might want to see. So, over the course of these two presentations, hopefully I've explained that the history of UK politics is very long, but the overall story is of a gradual shift of power from a king who was a tyrant to the people who do vote and choose the people to represent them. And that as a consequence, we live in a democracy. And a democracy where a parliament should represent the people's will and that in the UK the legal system is independent of government, and importantly that we have a role in voting, in campaigning, in discussing and in learning about how we want to live and how we might create that. Thank you.